3 days without food turns a village into a nightmare. Bread is gone. The last crust was bark, dirt, and desperation baked into something harder than bone. People wake dizzy, not from sleep, but from the absence of it. Their stomachs twist like knotted rope. The air smells of smoke and rot. Someone is cooking something. The scent promises meat, but the truth is far less comforting. Sometimes it's horse flesh. Sometimes it isn't a horse at all. In the Middle Ages, famine didn't just empty stomachs, it erased boundaries. Morality, taste, and dignity vanished beneath the grind of hunger. Every rule about what counted as food was rewritten with shaking hands and hollow eyes. Modern life worries about skipping lunch. Medieval life was a slow-motion collapse, where the only rule was simple: survive the night. Because when famine ruled the land, nothing was off the table. When the fields died before the people did. In the early 1300s, Northern Europe became a canvas of ruin. Rain fell for weeks, then months, until the land itself began to drown. Wheat fields turned to marshes. Barley collapsed under endless gray skies. By midsummer, villagers watched helplessly as their livelihoods decayed in place, soggy, molding, and useless. The Great Famine of 1315 didn't arrive with a roar, but with a slow, wet sigh. Rivers swelled beyond their banks, turning roads into rivers and pastures into lakes. Grain stores, once carefully guarded, sprouted green mold overnight. Livestock drowned where they stood or starved as fodder rotted in flooded barns. Even the bees died, and with them, honey, the last trace of sweetness in a bitter age. What little food remained never reached the hungry. Lords and church officials demanded their tithes first, insisting that divine order required obedience, even as their peasants collapsed in the mud. Desperate families resorted to digging up roots, chewing bark, or boiling weeds. Children, too weak to cry, wasted away quietly in corners while parents bartered tools, land, or their own dignity for a single loaf of dark, coarse bread. By winter, the roads were lined with corpses too numerous to bury. Chroniclers wrote of travelers collapsing mid-step, of mothers found frozen beside their infants. Some villages simply ceased to exist, swallowed by silence and rain. In modern times, the phrase food shortage means a late shipment or empty supermarket shelves. In 1316, it meant the sound of shovels striking shallow graves. The landscape of Europe became an open wound, festering beneath the constant drizzle. The fields had died first, but soon the people followed one gray dawn after another until hunger became the most reliable season of all. Why even the bread wanted everyone dead? When the famine refused to end, survivors turned to what little grain remained, unaware that the harvest itself had turned against them. In the damp corners of storage barns, rye had begun to rot, overtaken by a black fungus called Claviceps purpurea ergot. The mold was invisible to the hungry, but its punishment was unforgettable. Those who ate contaminated bread suffered what chroniclers later called the holy fire. Fingers burned as if dipped in boiling oil, limbs convulsed, twisted, and blackened until they simply fell away. Villagers stumbled through the streets in feverish trances, shrieking visions of demons clawing at their flesh. Monks prayed for deliverance, believing Satan himself had come to collect his due. Entire communities were overtaken by what modern historians recognize as mass ergot poisoning. But in the Middle Ages, there were only two explanations: sin or sorcery. In France, victims were marched barefoot to shrines dedicated to Saint Anthony, whose monks cared for the afflicted. The monastery records describe endless processions of hollow faces, burned skin, and trembling hands reaching for salvation, or at least for something that didn't hurt. The irony was merciless. Bread, the sacred foundation of both diet and faith, had become the vehicle of torment. And still, people ate. Hunger demanded obedience to biology, not theology. For every loaf that killed, 10 more were baked the same way, damp, dark, and deadly. Bakers swore the grain looked fine. Farmers swore the weather had simply cursed them. None of it mattered. The poison kept spreading, carried not by malice, but by desperation. In a world where starvation was constant and science was rumor, even survival came with consequences. Bread no longer symbolized life. It became a warning, a daily reminder that salvation and suffering could taste exactly the same. The Great Bark Bray. By the third year of famine, imagination replaced agriculture. When flour disappeared entirely, peasants turned to the forests. Birch bark, pine, and straw were ground into powder, mixed with whatever scraps of flour remained, and baked into what passed for bread. The result was gray, heavy, and nearly inedible, a meal that mocked the idea of nourishment. In Scandinavia and across the Baltic, bark bread became both a survival tactic and a national trauma. Chroniclers described people chewing for hours on a single slice, trying to convince their bodies that the taste of dirt meant something edible. The bread filled the stomach, but it starved everything else. Children suffered first. Malnutrition swelled their bellies while their ribs pressed sharply beneath paper-thin skin. Adults endured dizziness, weakness, and an exhaustion that felt like drowning on dry land. Yet, for many, bark bread was the only thing keeping families alive long enough to witness the next harvest or the next funeral. In some regions, a strange pride developed around these loaves. Villagers swapped recipes, comparing ratios of tree to flour as if innovation might disguise despair. The smell of smoke and sap became the scent of survival. Modern historians estimate that millions across Northern Europe survived those years only because of bark bread. But survival came at a cost. Teeth shattered, stomachs failed. Generations later, folk songs still whispered about the winter of trees, when forests fed the people and never forgot it. Bark bread wasn't food. It was proof that humanity will eat the world itself before it surrenders to hunger. It kept hearts beating, but only just. And as famine slowly loosened its grip, the people who endured it carried a bitter understanding. The line between sustenance and suffering is thinner than a slice of bark baked too long over a dying fire. Soup of stones, grass, and regret. By the height of the famine, the medieval pot had become a monument to desperation. Fire crackled beneath iron cauldrons day and night, but what simmered inside was more ritual than recipe. Pebbles were boiled to add flavor. Grass, moss, and shredded leather became ingredients. When the smell of cooking drifted through a village, it no longer promised food, it promised survival theater. Water, once taken for granted, became the base of nearly every meal. Some added bark shavings or crushed bones. Others, in slightly better condition, stretched the illusion further with a few shriveled carrots or turnip leaves. The resulting stew resembled mud, both in taste and appearance. Chroniclers wrote that peasants drank it with trembling hands, grateful for the warmth even if it carried no nourishment. Rats, dogs, and cats, once household companions, turned into meat for the lucky. Children were sent to chase vermin in barns, and every squeal meant dinner. In some towns, a single onion could serve 20 people, passed around like sacred relics. Those with nothing left simply boiled plain water to hear it bubble, pretending for a few precious minutes that something was cooking. The smell of boiled leather became familiar across Europe. Old boots, belts, even the covers of books found their way into pots. Hunger had erased distinctions between edible and impossible. Anything that softened in water became food in theory. For the starving, soup was no longer comfort. It was defiance. Each bubble rising to the surface whispered that something, somewhere, was still alive. But even defiance couldn't fill empty stomachs forever. The line between life and death was measured in ladles, and in most villages, the pot eventually fell silent. Meat, but make it horrifying. When famine stretched into years, meat returned, but not the kind anyone celebrated. Once the cattle and pigs were gone, people turned to the animals that remained. Horses, dogs, and rats were hunted, cooked, and traded in secret. The market smelled of smoke, tallow, and something uncomfortably human. Tanners boiled animal hides into thick, gelatinous soup. The gluey broth stuck to spoons and throats alike. Executioners, whose profession left them with unique access to flesh, quietly sold the leftovers of their work. Official records later described this as resourcefulness. The people who ate it had no illusions. It was survival stripped bare of humanity. Graveyards were not always left untouched. Chroniclers in England and France reported bones gnawed clean and burial sites disturbed. It's unclear whether the remains were dug up intentionally or scavenged by starving animals, but either explanation spoke to the same horror. Diseases followed the meat trade closely. Rotten flesh carried pestilence faster than it carried strength. Yet no one stopped. The alternative was emptiness. Some recipes even circulated for cooking vermin properly to make the rat tender became a genuine phrase in 14th century towns. The smell of markets grew unbearable, a mixture of decay, smoke, and denial. Priests called it sin, nobles called it savagery, but for the poor, it was simply Tuesday. Each bite carried a confession. The will to live outweighed disgust, shame, or fear of divine judgment. When hunger reached its worst, meat was no longer defined by species, only by availability. Every living thing became potential sustenance. Even the human imagination, once a refuge, began to taste like ash. Faith, fear, and famine crimes. Starvation has a way of breaking both the body and the mind. In the Middle Ages, it also broke faith. Churches overflowed with processions of the desperate men and women marching barefoot through mud, beating their backs bloody with whips in hopes of divine mercy. Monks chanted day and night. Bells rang for repentance that never came. Priests declared the famine a punishment from God. If the rain refused to stop, it must have been because sin had multiplied. Villagers turned inward, hunting for someone to blame. Witches were the obvious choice. Accusations spread faster than food. Old women, healers, or anyone with herbs were suddenly suspects in the crime of bad weather. Public trials became theater for the starving. A baker might be lynched for hiding bread. A widow might be drowned for cursing the fields. The logic was brutal but comforting. If someone was to blame, then maybe salvation was still possible. Flagellant groups roamed from town to town, whipping themselves until blood ran into the mud. They preached that the world's suffering could be cleansed only through pain. In many regions, these movements grew so powerful that the church itself tried to suppress them. But faith, once infected by terror, had its own hunger. Chroniclers recorded stories of priests blessing rain barrels, relics being paraded through flooded streets, and congregations praying for the sky to close. None of it worked. The heavens stayed gray, and the fields stayed dead. Religion, meant to console, became a mirror for fear. It was easier to condemn a neighbor than to face an indifferent climate. And so the famine took not only lives but also reason. By the time the skies finally cleared, faith itself had been thinned, boiled down like everything else until it barely resembled what it once was. Cannibal nightmares. When humanity finally snapped. By the third year of famine, the records grew quieter, not because the hunger had ended, but because words could no longer bear witness to what was happening. The parchment stayed blank where scribes once wrote prayers. Chroniclers hesitated, dipping their quills into ink that now carried the weight of guilt. Villages vanished without fire or plague to explain them. Travelers disappeared along forest roads that no longer echoed with footsteps. What remained were rumors, fragments whispered by survivors whose eyes never seemed to focus quite right again. Some spoke of markets that sold mystery meat. Others told of mothers who buried their infants one day and exhumed them the next. These weren't wild accusations meant to shame the desperate. They were quiet admissions, passed from trembling lips by people who had finally reached the edge of human endurance. Cannibalism in the Middle Ages wasn't born from madness or malice. It was born from mathematics, the brutal logic of survival. When every barn was empty, when bark and rats were gone, the body began calculating its own worth. Flesh became currency. Conscience became a luxury no one could afford. Chroniclers like Jean de Venette and the monks of St. Albans wrote carefully, wrapping horror in scripture. They called the acts unspeakable, as if refusing to describe them might make them less real. Yet between the lines, the truth bled through. Parents devoured children. Strangers fed on the dead found by the roadside. The distinction between butcher and victim blurred completely. The church tried to contain the panic with silence. No sermons, no confessions, only the reminder that even damnation required strength, and most people had none left to spare. Graveyards were plundered, and the air around them grew heavy with the sickly sweetness of rot. What famine didn't consume, shame did. Those who survived carried their memories like open wounds. They avoided each other's eyes, terrified of seeing recognition. And the chroniclers, once proud recorders of truth, learned the art of omission. Their ink dried faster than their courage. By the time the rains finally eased, hunger had evolved into something far crueler, a predator that lived inside the human mind. It was no longer about food. It was about what people were willing to become when survival demanded the unthinkable. The famine market's misery for sale. Even in Rhone, The art of profit survived. When the fields failed and the graves filled, commerce adapted. Lords sealed their granaries, waiting for desperation to ferment into gold. What little grain remained was sold back to the starving at prices that mocked mercy. Coin by coin, the poor bought the illusion of survival. Bread became a luxury item, measured not in weight, but in guilt. The same nobles who preached charity on Sundays counted their profits by candlelight, listening to the cries outside their walls like a distant, haunting choir. Merchants found new trades in the unthinkable. Animal fat gave way to human tallow, melted down from the nameless dead. Apothecaries sold miracle cures made of ground bone. Even priests adapted salvation itself was available for purchase. The church collected alms with one hand and absolution with the other, promising eternal peace to those who couldn't afford a single meal. Black markets thrived in alleyways and graveyards. Here, a scrap of meat fetched the price of a month's labor. There, a bag of moldy flour exchanged hands like contraband. Lawmen looked away, some out of pity, most out of hunger. The famine had erased law as surely as it had erased decency. Money lost its meaning. It could buy food, but not fairness. The poor bartered labor, dignity, even their own bodies, while the wealthy invented new forms of greed to stay entertained. Chronicles from Flanders to France describe nobles hosting feasts while their tenants ate boiled grass outside the castle gates. Famine revealed what war never could, the true hierarchy of hunger. The powerful consumed without consequence, the weak perished without witness, and those in between learned to trade misery like currency. Disaster didn't erase greed, it refined it. Misery became a marketplace. Even starvation could be monetized if one had enough cruelty and patience. When history later spoke of the Great Famine, it named the rains and the rot, but rarely the profiteers. Yet the ledgers survived, full of neat handwriting and perfect arithmetic. In the margins of every account book from that era lies a quiet truth that some didn't just survive the famine, they thrived on it. The taste of survival, what hunger leaves behind. When the skies finally cleared and crops began to grow again, there was no celebration. The survivors had forgotten how to rejoice. Their bodies had endured, but something within them had withered beyond repair. Villages once filled with laughter now echoed with absence. Doors hung open to homes where no one returned. Fields once rich with grain were marked by shallow graves. Those who remained walked slowly, as though afraid to disturb the silence that hunger had left behind. The first harvest after the famine should have been sacred. Instead, it felt like an apology too late to matter. Bread, once a symbol of life, became a reminder of death. Every loaf carried memories of those who had starved waiting for such a sight. Some refused to eat wheat at all, turning instead to roots and herbs as if the famine still watched, waiting for them to trust food again. Stories and songs began to treat hunger like a living thing. It was not merely remembered, it was feared. Parents told their children tales of the famine, as if warning them about a predator still lurking beyond the door. Hunger had taken on a soul cruel, patient, and unforgettable. Even the church changed. Sermons grew quieter, more cautious. Priests no longer promised abundance, they promised endurance. The faithful prayed less for prosperity and more for survival. The world had learned that divine mercy had limits, and that rain could destroy just as easily as it could bless. Civilization continued, markets reopened, fields turned green again, but beneath the surface, the memory of famine clung like smoke. Those who lived through it became cautious to the point of paranoia, storing grain in hidden pits, counting every crumb, mistrusting every feast. Generations later, the famine was reduced to numbers in a chronicle, a tragedy measured in tons of grain and years of rain. But for those who had endured it, it remained something far more personal. Hunger had entered their bones, their stories, their prayers. The Great Famine eventually passed, but the fear it birthed never did. In every loaf baked after, there lingered the taste of survival, a flavor no one ever wanted to remember, yet no one could forget. Even as life slowly returned, caution became instinct. Villagers inspected every loaf, every root, every clump of grain, as though the famine itself might rise again from the soil. Children grew up learning the language of scarcity before they learned to read, memorizing which fields were safe, which wells were clean, which neighbors could be trusted. Songs and prayers carried a double meaning, gratitude for survival and a quiet acknowledgement of what had been lost. Festivals were muted, laughter tempered by memory. Even joy came wrapped in vigilance, as though every smile risked summoning hunger back from the shadows. Subscribe because history's darkest hunger still has stories left to tell.